You're listening to the American Scald's Nordic Sound podcast, promoting Nordic music history and culture wherever podcasts can be found. In the 1920s, when a student asked Maurice Ravel why he was so passionate about teaching Edvard Grieg's music to his students, Ravel answered, "You can't imagine the power Grieg's music had in Paris. Through him, we could perceive the mountains and the sea, gnomes and giants, a world that the city had made us forget." This is the effect Edvard Grieg had on a whole generation of Europeans in the last decade of the 19th century, and long into the 20th century. Sibelius, Fauré, Dvorak, Rachmaninoff, Ravel, Debussy, Granger, Bartok, and even John Cage are just a few of the most influential composers who admired and learned from Grieg's music. Further, Grieg was one of the most respected composers among his fellow generation, with a personal favorite anecdote of Brahms and Tchaikovsky both inviting Grieg to play peacekeeper at an awkward Christmas dinner. And with audiences, if we are to take comments from Ravel and Fauré at face value, Grieg was the single most beloved composer during the Belle Epoque in Paris, which is the reason why Grieg's harmonic innovations are now seen, in retrospect, as one of the prime progenitors of Impressionism in music. For his lyric pieces, 10 books of short piano works published over the course of 40 years were in fact core pedagogical texts which were common practice for teaching young piano students in the 1880s and onward, effectively putting Grieg's music and imagination in millions of homes across Europe. And with that generation, including the likes of Debussy and Ravel, being exposed to Grieg's frankly weird but charming ideas during their formative years, it's why Grieg would have had such an impact on future modernist and impressionist icons. Even further, Grieg's songs, which are rarely discussed today, could be heard in any home with a piano in Paris during this time, as his style of song, much like Kjerulf and Bakke Grøndahl's from episodes 6 and 7, spoke more to Parisians yearning for a simpler time than did the prevailing German tradition of art song. But back on the home front, Grieg did for Scandinavia what Ole Bull did just for Norway, but even for Norway, Grieg had a much more significant impact on the country's music culture. In his time, and even today, Grieg was seen as a champion of Scandinavian identity, a composer who showed Europe once and for all that the Nordic countries were not some acultural backwoods struggling to understand how instruments worked, and even flipping the narrative around in showing how much music benefits from more diverse perspectives, and how much Europe could gain from a Nordic perspective in general. In a generation when Germans had a chokehold on practice and tradition, Grieg dared to be different, and in so doing proved to have a profound and lasting impact on the generation after him, who were inspired to break from tradition and stay true to themselves despite constant attacks from music critics trying to snuff out any sign of new and diverse ideas in music. But you won't find any of this in music history classes or core textbooks on music history. Believe me, I've taught them for years. Instead, Grieg's entries in music history textbooks today are relegated mostly to footnotes about nationalism, citing In the Hall of the Mountain King and Morning Mood, which everyone knows the tune to without knowing who wrote it, but if it's a particularly responsible author, they will at least mention his piano concerto, one of the most popular piano concertos all the way into the 20th century, citing a music critic from the 1930s who complained the Grieg concerto was played out and stale. 150 years after its premiere, and 90 years after that newspaper article, it remains a staple in the piano repertoire. Further, in reading and teaching about those who owed much of their inspiration to Grieg like Bartok, Ravel, and a reluctant Debussy, credit is rarely given to a lot of Grieg's innovations which this generation of composers built upon. These are the circumstances which inspire this particular episode of the Nordic Sound series. Every episode here is driven, of course, by an appreciation of Nordic music and a desire to spread that appreciation, but this episode is driven by something deeper. This episode is a work of passion, and for this reason it will be a much different episode than we usually see on the Nordic Sound. This will be a longer form, in-depth look at the life and legacy of the most significant composer in the history of Nordic music, for the purpose of doing my part in setting the record straight regarding Grieg's place in music history, and to show that Grieg is more than how he is remembered today. For Grieg was not simply a national composer who played with folk melodies for lack of originality, nor was he just a composer who wrote piano works best fit for amateurs with no worth to proper performers and composers, two criticisms which come up all too often. Edvard Grieg was much more than this. Essentially, as we will learn, Grieg flipped the game board for future composers. He changed the rules of theory and composition, and changed the rules of just how much German critics get to dictate how other ethnicities get to write music. In essence, Grieg stood as an idol for the generation after him, and through his music he inspired many to compose what they felt was true to themselves, and as Ravel's remark to his students shows, he inspired composers, performers, and audiences alike to take a moment to look out their window and appreciate the natural world around them. For these same reasons, I hope you come with me on this journey in taking a closer look at a composer than we typically do on the Nordic Sound channel. So, standing at a whopping even 5 feet tall with a face easily mistaken for Mark Twain's and Albert Einstein's, let's learn the real story of Edvard Grieg, a true mountain king. Grieg was born into a bourgeois Bergen family much like Ole Bull's on June 15, 1843. But notably, Grieg's father's side were immigrants from Scotland after the Battle of Culloden, so Scots and Norwegians get to share him to some extent. But Grieg first picked up music from his mother, who he had a close relationship with throughout his life. He would take piano lessons from her well into his teenage years. Of this early stage of his music experience, Grieg would later recount that he much preferred to just sit at the piano and play with chords and harmonies. No exercises, no melodies. He simply enjoyed the act of creating new chords, and playing with different sound palettes at the keyboard, something we will come back to later when we get to his piano music and his influence on Impressionism. Now, I mentioned Ole Bull from episode 5 for a reason, for if you remember, in his episode I mentioned that it was he who was responsible for Grieg being sent to music school. Ole Bull was in fact close family friends with the Griegs, and one day he heard little Edvard playing on his mother's piano at just 15 years old, and convinced his parents that their son had great talent, and that he would write to have him enrolled at Leipzig Conservatory if they wished. And wish they did, for Grieg's older brother was already enrolled at Leipzig for cello, which is why Grieg would later write a cello sonata of reworked material from his violin sonatas, as the sonata was meant as a gift to his dear older brother. Grieg would enroll at the conservatory in Leipzig in 1858. At Leipzig Conservatory, Grieg would learn from notable music teachers Karl Reinecke, Moritz Hauptmann, and Ignaz Moschels. Without knowing their names, all you need to know is that these teachers were staunch traditionalists in the German school of composition. Under the mentorship of these highly respected teachers of German tradition, he studied closely the music of Mozart, Beethoven, Mendelssohn, Schumann, and Wagner. After graduating with excellent marks in 1862, Grieg moved to Copenhagen in 1863, as it was the only Scandinavian city at the time engaging in the arts on an international level. In Copenhagen, Grieg found himself surrounded by more Scandinavian musicians, but especially the Norwegian Rikard Nordraak, the composer of Norway's national anthem. Together, Grieg and Nordraak discussed their many concerns with the national identity of their then marginalized native land of Norway. And despite this growing engagement with broader questions of Norwegian politics and culture, Grieg continued his training in composition under the mentorship of Dane Niels Gade, who consistently tried to steer Grieg away from Norwegian-derived music, as evidenced by Gade's incredibly harsh criticisms of Grieg's violin sonatas, and his constant pressure on Grieg to write a symphony. Now, Grieg did end up writing that symphony, and it even had a performance in Copenhagen, but Grieg would soon after write Never to be Performed on the top of the score. Now, why would Grieg do this? Well, remember that at the time, Nordic composers of Grieg's generation were always discussing and thinking about their Nordic identities in music, and how they can express themselves in a way that was true to them. Considering what we discussed in episodes 8 and 9 with Winterhelm and Svensson, the symphony was symbolically seen as the weight of German hegemony and expectation in music. In essence, real composers wrote symphonies. Real German composers, that is, in the minds of Grieg and other young Nordic composers. Why was the bombastic and overstated nature of the symphony the end-all be-all of music composition? What about the more humble, understated means of music making? Grieg would put it best later in life when he would write, "We, that is, Scandinavians, are of North Teutonic stock, and as such we have much of the Germanic people's propensity towards melancholy and brooding. However, we do not share their desire to express themselves broadly and verbosely. To the contrary, we have always loved brevity and succinctness, the clear and concise mode of expression, just as you can find in our sagas, and as any traveler could observe even today in our social intercourse. These qualities are also what we aim for in our artistic endeavors." Keeping this in mind, while having a general disdain for most German music, Grieg did develop a notable passion for the music of Mozart and Robert Schumann, coincidentally two German composers who had a large output of more gentle and lighthearted music. To emphasize this, Grieg published an essay early in life in a German music journal discussing Schumann's songs and what made them unique and impactful, and Grieg's first two song collections were very much written in the style of Schumann. In short, Grieg's stay in Denmark was a formative period of Grieg's career, where he regularly wrestled with questions regarding identity, style, his place as a Norwegian composer, and what he wanted to do with his music career. Did he want to support and assimilate to the status quo, or did he want to stand apart, reject the German-dominated way of doing things, and write music that he felt was closer to his own identity and worldview, and in fact write music which he felt best represented his homeland with its own voice? Also, a little extra insight into his life, this is when Grieg married Nina, his first cousin. Look. Believe it or not, I asked around, and 150 years ago it was pretty normal in Norway and Denmark apparently. And they were obviously meant for each other as they remained married for the rest of their lives with a mostly healthy relationship. And all of Grieg's songs would be written for the female voice so that she could sing them, and she continued to be his strongest source of song inspiration throughout his life. And again, as discussed in episode 7 with Grøndal, everyone and their mother seemed to be writing music for Nina and Edvard to play together, so we do have Nina to thank for Grieg's beautiful songs. To emphasize this, Grieg scholar and performer Beryl Foster, no relation, also observed in her book The Songs of Edvard Grieg that Grieg's song output would be at its lowest when their relationship was on the rocks, but skyrocket when they would reconcile. So her role in his creative process cannot be understated. During his final year in Denmark, Grieg was still troubled by the fact that, despite all the progress that had been made in Norwegian music since the time of Thrain and Alle Bull, it was still barely a fledgling music culture compared to the rest of Europe, or even just compared to Copenhagen. He lamented the fact that mainland Europe still didn't know much about Norway, nor did they seem to respect the culture there, and so he felt that it was his job to remedy this through his music. Which is why he ultimately decided to return to Christiania, now called Oslo, to promote Norwegian music at the source. It was at this time in 1866 when Otto Winterhjelm from episode 9 welcomed Grieg to the city with a rousing article in the newspaper, and when he started to recruit Grieg for his vision of a Norwegian National Music Academy. Grieg would spend a few years leading the Philharmonic societies there, giving concerts and teaching, and in 1871 he did establish a music association with Johan Svensson from episode 10. However, after his years here, he found that Christiania still wasn't the right place for him. I can guess that it's because of the fact that Christiania was essentially Norway's Little Denmark, but that's just speculation on my part. It should be noted, though, that it was during this time period when Grieg wrote and published his famous piano concerto, today known simply as The Grieg, and when Agatha Bakke Grøndal from episode 7 gave her debut concert performing the piece to critical acclaim, establishing it as a beloved and core piano concerto for the classical music world, and marking the beginning of Agatha Bakke Grøndal's long and impressive career as a concert pianist. In 1874, Grieg received his first government grant to perform and compose full-time, and began giving concerts in Hardanger and Bergen, and he even picked up the torch of leading the Harmonien briefly, discussed in episodes 2, 3, and 5 from 1880 to 1882. And this is when I get to tell the lovely story of the little home Grieg had built for himself called Troldhaugen. Now, it's no secret that Grieg never really liked city life, so he used some of his government grant to build himself and Nina a villa up in the hills near Bergen with a composing cabin, reminiscent of Thoreau's Walden hut in the backyard overlooking Nordos Lake. And fun fact, this hut was designed and built by Schack Bull, one of Alle Bull's nephews. Once the building was complete, Grieg called it "my best composition hitherto," and named it Troldhaugen, or Troll Valley in English, as Grieg learned that was what many of the local children called the area he built a cabin in. Just a charming story all around. This building still stands today, and you can visit it as the current Grieg Museum. It was also in Bergen where, in the 1870s, Grieg would also help establish the first Hardanger fiddling competitions as well that are still alive and well today. Fiddlers present at the competition noted Grieg always sitting in the front row, furiously scribbling down the melodies they played by ear and listening to the fiddlers with childlike enthusiasm. This shows Grieg putting his words into actions when it came to Norwegianism, and he's continuing Alle Bull's vision of a revitalized Hardanger fiddling tradition. Now, it was at this point in Grieg's life where he started to get involved in Norwegianism beyond music, and started working closely with two titans of Norwegian literature, Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson, I swear that's a real name, and Henrik Ibsen. Grieg was close friends with Bjørnson for a few years, and wrote a beautiful collection of songs, Opus 21, based on Bjørnson's Fisher Maiden poems. However, the two drifted apart for two primary reasons. First, Bjørnson was a Scandinavist, discussed in episode 10 with Svensson as the ideology that the Nordics were better off together in a union or an alliance. Grieg, of course, was a staunch Norwegianist, the ideology that Norway was better off independent after half a millennium of subjection to Danish and Swedish crowns. So, disagreeing on a political level but still respecting each other as fellow bearers of Norwegian culture, things were fine. But Bjørnson wanted to work with Grieg to compose either an opera or musical play based on the book Heimskringla, the book of sagas telling the stories of Norwegian kings such as Olav Tryggvason, Harald Hardrada, and Saint Olaf, a crucial text for Norwegian nationalism during the 19th century and onward. Bjørnson was working much too slow for Grieg's taste, however, and while waiting months for the text from Bjørnson, Grieg was sent a letter from Henrik Ibsen, a Norwegian poet and playwright in 1874. The letter reads as follows. Dear Mr. Grieg, I send you these lines because of a plan I intend to carry out, and regarding which I desire to know whether you will cooperate with me. The matter is as follows. A third edition of Peer Gynt is to appear shortly, and I intend to arrange it for performance on the stage. Will you compose the music required for this? I will explain briefly how I am thinking of arranging the works. Ibsen goes on to explain scenes including the beloved satyr girls, folk weddings, trolls, about as Norwegian as you can get. Grieg, of course, obliged to offer almost immediately, as Ibsen was already a well-known name in Norway. Now, for those of you who don't recognize the title Peer Gynt and immediately know what's about to happen, this is the musical opportunity which changed the course of Grieg's life and legacy. I can guarantee you that you have heard the music to Peer Gynt at least once in your life, as it is everywhere in pop culture, mostly the Hall of the Mountain King or Morning Mood, both used extensively today in cartoons, advertising, and elementary school music curriculum. After years in development, when the play finally premiered, this was the work that put Norwegian music and culture on every continent of the world save for Antarctica. The play itself was a work of pure rejection of norms. Ibsen specifically set out to create a play which subverted all expectations of 19th century stagecraft, just as Grieg was looking for ways to subvert expectations of 19th century music composition. The two were a match made in heaven. Now, as it usually goes, because the play succeeded despite not following the rules, Ibsen received hostile reactions from other Nordic writers who relied on those rules to succeed. But the play became an instant favorite in Paris especially, and influenced Parisian drama and theater in permanent ways that can still be felt today. The music, though, in the first year of the play's existence, would be performed over 1,000 times across the globe, with constant orders for scores of what we now call the Peer Gynt suites. To summarize this point in Grieg's career, Grieg was now, in 1875, a household name on every continent save for Antarctica, and his music was being played everywhere. Even Ibsen understood that the biggest reason for the play's success was Grieg's music, as it was pretty much all any of the reviews talked about, and this sparked a lifelong friendship between the two, and Grieg would set much of Ibsen's poetry to music in the future. However, this sparked some envy from Bjørnson, and out of spite, the two drifted apart. So with the 1870s coming to a close, Grieg was now starting to find his voice as a composer, and of course find much success not just in music, but in his vision of telling Norway's story on its own terms through the success of his music and Ibsen's play. And by the 1880s, Grieg would be one of, if not the most popular composers in Belle Epoque Paris, and this is, to me, one of the most important chapters of Grieg's story, but unfortunately, the most often overlooked. It's a little-known fact of music history that Grieg's music, and indeed much of Norwegian art, was immensely popular during Paris's Belle Epoque. In fact, if one is to take Gabriel Fauré's 1903 Le Figaro article at face value, Grieg was the most significant composer in Parisian music life at the turn of the century. He writes, "Among the living composers, I know none who enjoys so much popular favor in France as Grieg does. None whose work have so deeply entered into our most intimate musical life as his compositions, which we find so natural, so charming, so refined, exotic, and individual." Now, there are many reasons as to why Grieg's music was not just critically well received, but also integral to French culture at the turn of the century. But in order to understand why Grieg was such a prominent figure in Paris, we need to understand the context in which his music was being heard, and the state of Parisian music culture in general during the final decades of the 19th century. In fact, it was the rise of Wagner's presence which caused something of an existential crisis for French composers who were concerned that their own music culture was being conquered and uprooted by Wagner's operas and the dominating Austro-German music tradition which he represented. Sound a little familiar? Now, while many French composers would come to respond to the threat of Wagnerism and Austro-German tradition in their own ways, one of the overarching responses was that of cultivating a French style of art influenced by exoticism and Orientalism, of looking to art made elsewhere. Whereas Austro-German music tradition can be seen as an insular tradition which primarily searches inward for influence, the French seemed to believe the best way to resist this was to build a music culture founded on musical impulses from beyond their own borders. Interestingly enough, this Parisian obsession with the foreign and the different also reached out elsewhere within Europe, not just places really far away, with Norway being one of the most significant sources next to Russia. And this is what led to a significant uptick in the popularity of Norwegian music, art, and theater in Paris during the 1890s. Such attitudes toward Norwegian art and its entanglement with Parisian obsessions with the foreign and exotic can be found most succinctly in a speech given by the Minister of Public Instruction in 1894, when he writes, "This year it's the literature, theater, and music of certain races from the north that have had the honor of being in fashion. No one will regret it. We have been able to glimpse new horizons and taste the flavor of a certain number of powerful or subtle works with a somewhat distressing psychology, but an indisputable originality." For those wondering what the distressing psychology bit is about, it's absolutely referencing Ibsen's way of telling stories. This newfound interest in Norwegian music and art is evident in the remarkable increase in Grieg's presence in Parisian concert life from the 1880s onward. Grieg's music was in fact a yearly feature during this time, and his reputation peaked in 1894 when he conducted a sold-out show featuring only his own music, and this concert would earn the orchestra the second highest sales receipts for the whole season. All of this is especially important when considering, again, the identity crisis Parisians were facing against the looming Austro-German threat and Wagnerism, and what Grieg's music effectively represented to young composers in Paris at the end of the 19th century. Grieg's music seemed to be the perfect solution for a music culture looking to escape the continuing dominance of Austro-German music, a tradition which valued power and sublime grandeur. Grieg stood against all of that. His music constantly opposed the heroic victory and struggle narrative the Germans valued since Beethoven by just writing music depicting pleasant scenes of day-to-day Norwegian life. Now, the crux of Grieg's allure for the French can be found in what beauty meant to Grieg, reminding us of what Ravel told to that student at the top of the episode. Again, for Grieg, beauty is not limited to the grand and verbose as it is with German music, but oddly enough in a sense that reminds us of transcendentalism as explored by American writers like Thoreau and Walt Whitman. Opposing German ideals of beauty, Grieg's kind of beauty was not found in fear, darkness, power, or the infinite vastness of the cosmos, but rather in everyday life, in songbirds singing through the woods, in intimate gatherings of friends, and by the brooks weaving through Norwegian mountainsides. This was the impression that Grieg's music left on musicians growing up during the Belle Epoque, that the German way was not the only way. Thus, we can see how Grieg and the Norwegianist aesthetics were in a prime position of influence in the lives of musicians throughout Paris at the turn of the century. Which brings us to one of my favorite parts of Grieg's life to tell, his interactions with the generation after him. More than just through his music, Grieg himself was quite present in the lives of Parisian conservatory students as well, most notably Frederick Delius and Maurice Ravel. Delius and Ravel both greatly admired Grieg as a role model for individual expression, and Ravel especially would perform his works often, notably his piano concerto and his Norwegian dances. Ravel would even, as a student, make an arrangement of variations on Åsa's Death from the Peer Gynt Suite, and would perform Grieg's piano concerto on at least one occasion. The following story from Delius provides a telling vignette regarding Grieg's position as a role model in the lives of these Parisian students. He writes, "While the bright-eyed company discussed music, Ravel quietly went over to the piano and began to play one of the master's Norwegian dances from his Opus 72. Grieg listened with a smile, but then began to show signs of impatience, suddenly getting up and saying sharply, 'No, young man, not like that at all. Much more rhythm. It's a folk dance. You should see the peasants at home, with the fiddler stamping in time with the music. Play it again.' And while Ravel played, the little man jumped up and skipped about the room to the astonishment of the company." Now, a little bit more about Grieg's Opus 72, his Norwegian peasant dances from 1903. This work is particularly unusual, as Grieg collaborated with Hardanger fiddler Knut Dahle, one of the last living students of Müllerguten from episode 5. Dahle was afraid that the Hardanger fiddling tradition would die with him, so he asked Grieg to write down his melodies as folk musicians were not familiar with musical notation. Grieg obliged, and recruited close friend and next episode's composer Johan Halvorsen to mediate the Hardanger fiddle transcriptions into violin, then give those violin transcriptions to Grieg to put to piano. A very careful process, and for good reason, as Grieg learned throughout his life that he needed to treat native folk traditions with respect, unlike, in his opinion, Lindemann, who would change and alter melodies to better suit choir or piano works. Grieg wanted to emulate not just the melodies of the fiddle, but the sonic experience of the Hardanger fiddle with the foot-stomping, drones, and sympathetic resonances of the fiddle's open strings. This resulted in Opus 72, and is one of Grieg's most distinctive works and one of the most distinctive piano works of the late Romantic generation. It's this folk arrangement which is most crucial to Grieg's reception in Paris among conservatory students, as they would refer to this completely new and unprecedented style of piano playing as Le Nouveau Grieg, or the New Grieg. This was Grieg's final passion project before his death, and in my eyes serves as a beautiful culmination of his life's work fighting for a classical music style derived exclusively from Norwegian music culture and tradition. Very few, if any, composers of his generation would write a piece of music in collaboration with a folk musician, and even fewer would go so far as to treat that music on its own terms without making it more friendly for classical audiences. Sometime after Grieg danced for these students, Ravel and Delius would go on to agree that contemporary French music was simply Grieg plus the third act of Wagner's Tristan, which would put Grieg even on par with Wagner himself in terms of influence on the Parisian music scene. Grieg also exhibited a marked influence on the works of Delius and Percy Grainger, not only through his music but by being a present figure and mentor in the lives of both of these composers as well. Delius would be drawn most to the presence of nature in Grieg's music, and would remark in a letter to Grainger, "The feelings of nature, I think, is what I like so much in Grieg's best works." Again, putting the emphasis on Grieg's ability to communicate a distinctly Norwegian soundscape in his music. Even Debussy, the composer who prided himself most of all off of his own originality and inventiveness, could not escape influences from Grieg's music. Not only does his string quartet in G minor bear many striking resemblances to Grieg's in the same key, but he would write it in the years immediately following the first performance of this work at the National Society in Paris, which Debussy attended. Debussy would also attend the sold-out concert of 1894, though he would use his position as a critic to attack Grieg's appearance as well as his music. However, Debussy did have a habit of hiding his influences through toxic criticism, and this relationship with Grieg is no exception. The most telling example of Grieg's influence on Debussy's harmonic palette can be found in Debussy's Sunken Cathedral. In this piano work, Debussy builds upon an experiment of bell sonorities found in Grieg's lyric piece Klokkeklang, or bell ringing, written nearly a decade earlier. So at this point, the beating of the dead horse aside, hopefully we understand that Grieg's music is far from insular to Grieg's biography, or even to the history of Norwegian music. Because of Grieg's popularity and enduring presence in Paris in both concert and domestic settings, and how open Parisian musicians were to outside influences, the music of Grieg and Norway proves foundational to the formation of Parisian modernism at the turn of the century. For the very Norwegian soundscape Parisians so deeply adored in Grieg's music relied on what Grieg learned from his passion for Norwegian folk music. His influence proved to be long-lasting. For 20 years after Grieg's death, Ravel would admit that he had yet to write a piece of music without Grieg's influence, and John Cage, for all of his weirdness, would even remark in a 1985 interview that Grieg was his favorite composer growing up because, quote, "he had an independent mind. He was able to write all those fifths when they were forbidden." And of course, Bartok would get some of his ideas about treating folk music on its own terms from Grieg's Opus 72 as well, as he both attended the 1910 premiere in Paris and had a copy of the score on his bookshelf. And even beyond classical music, some more dedicated jazz enthusiasts listening may recall Duke Ellington arranging the Peer Gynt suites for his jazz ensemble, with his most popular being In the Hall of the Mountain King. I highly recommend listening to it even if jazz isn't your thing, as at the very least, it's very interesting. But for those of you who still might not be convinced of Grieg's reach after that, Grieg's music was also featured on albums by The Who, the Electric Light Orchestra, Apocalyptica, The Offspring, and many, many more. And so we find through the sentiments and works of prominent figures in Parisian music, from Fauré to Ravel to Bartok, that the music of Grieg and Norway as a whole left real and lasting influences on the generation after him, an influence that extends to the broader history of classical music at the turn of the century. And it's not so much Grieg's specifically Norwegian expression which influenced Parisian musicians of the next generation, but the fact that Grieg found such a unique mode of expression in spite of his German training. This important part of his personal history helped many young composers look to him as a role model in their own quest for individual expression outside of the long shadow of Austro-German music. For Grieg's music didn't simply represent Norway to the composers such as Ravel, Bartok, Grainger, Delius, Debussy, and Cage. It represented an effective break from a national and educational legacy which sought homogeneity in its students and its musicians. Grieg's music showed these young composers that it wasn't just Norway that deserved to have its own voice, but that each and every artist should have their own voice as well, be it national or personal. And it's for all of these reasons that, to me, Edvard Grieg's place in music history deserves far more respect. For as Bela Bartok remarked to a student, "Don't you know that Grieg was among the first to throw off the German yoke?" Unfortunately, Grieg suffered lung-related health issues his whole life, and died relatively young on September 4th, 1907, living just long enough to see Norway finally achieve independence in 1905, with much of his work at the forefront of making that remarkable moment a reality. Now, despite Grieg's last words being, "if it must be so," he was a remarkable writer, with his journals and letters containing golden nuggets of wisdom and philosophy which once again reminds us of transcendentalist writers like Emerson and Thoreau. But if I had to pick one of Grieg's finest passages to leave you with, it would be when he wrote, Artists like Bach and Beethoven erected churches and temples on the heights. I only wish to build dwellings for men in which they might feel happy and at home. And this, I think, is exactly what makes Grieg one of the most unique and beloved composers in music history. And so, friends, that brings us to the end of this special episode of the Nordic Sound Podcast. I hope you enjoyed going on this journey with me, and I hope that you've learned something new about Edvard Grieg's life and legacy, and maybe even gained a new appreciation for what he did for music at the turn of the century. If you liked this episode, be sure to leave a review and join the mailing list on my website so you don't miss out on updates on the channel. Anything you can do to help grow the channel is deeply appreciated. As always, you can find me at my website, theamericanscald.com, on YouTube, where you can now find the channel's first YouTube video, very exciting, and you can of course join the community over on Reddit at r/NordicSound. Lastly, be sure to watch for the Nordic Sound today this week, as I'll be doing a little bit of a marathon to cover a wide range of Nordic acts to get myself caught up, and ultimately leading up to another video on YouTube channel this Friday relating to Hardanger fiddling, as it only gets more important from here on out. So, thanks again for joining me on this special episode, and I look forward to seeing you again on the American Scald's Nordic Sound Podcast.